we don't always have to use carbs and carbs alone. We can use other things too to produce ATP and whatnot, or to metabolize things. And that's where we can talk about lipids and lipid metabolism. So we'll talk about how lipids get absorbed. We'll talk about what do we do when we have insoluble lipids, water insoluble lipids, and as well as water soluble ones, and how we transport them. We'll talk about lipogenesis and what stimulates that. We'll talk about lipolysis. We'll talk about beta oxidation, and then ketogenesis. So let's start by just talking about the different processes, right? And again, if it's red, right, which are the top 3 ones here, these are catabolic. If it's green, right, which are the next 2, those are going to be anabolic. So lipolysis, as the name implies, is going to split a lipid apart. So we're going to break something down from a triglyceride to its fatty acids. Beta oxidation, we can take those fatty acids to produce ATP. In ketogenesis, we're going to take the fatty acids and convert them to ketone bodies, which can also be used to produce ATP. So we can go one of 2 ways, basically, to use lipids to produce ATP. We can go through a beta oxidation, or we can use ketogenesis. When we're fed, we can produce fats. So lipogenesis, we're going to form triglycerides. Usually we're thinking in forming adipose tissue, so the subcutaneous fat pads, so the fat underneath your skin. And we can form other lipids to use things structurally or to make essential molecules like phospholipids, right? We need those to make all of our cells' membranes. Lipoproteins, which transport cholesterol. This is when you think of your cholesterol, like your HDL and your LDL, right? That's what we're talking about. We're talking about lipoproteins. Thromboplastins for blood clotting, and then cholesterol, which we use to make things like bile salts. We use it as a basis for things like steroid-based hormones like cortisol, testosterone, estrogen, aldosterone, progesterone, right? Things like that. So how do we bring fats in from the food we eat, right? How do we absorb them from foods? This is going to happen in the small intestine. Because they are water insoluble, because they're hydrophobic, we need a little bit of assistance here to emulsify these lipids into smaller droplets. This is where bile salts come in. So bile salts from the liver are going to basically create little coverings, little coatings around the fat droplets. And when they do that, they're going to break the really big fat droplets in the stomach and then the small intestine into very small ones. So now we have something that's more manageable, right? Pancreatic lipase comes in. This is going to take the triglycerides and break them down into the glycerol and the fatty acids. And then we have micelles, which are like these little teeny tiny droplets now, are small enough to actually get into our small intestine cells. Once we get those lipids inside of the cells of the small intestine, we're then going to combine them with cholesterol and APO proteins to form chylomicrons, right, which is a lipoprotein. So you can just say we're forming a lipoprotein. Then we transport this to the lymphatic system. We do not go to the bloodstream, right? We go to the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system will then transport things for a little while before they can make their way into the bloodstream. And so here's our lipoprotein, right? Our lipoprotein, right? We have the non-polar lipids like cholesterol and triglycerides, right? But we're surrounded by phospholipids and cholesterol, which do have a small affinity for water. So to transport lipids, so things that are like steroid-based hormones, cholesterol, triglycerides, because they're in a water-based bloodstream, we need something to keep them from globbing together, right? Because if we had nothing to surround these lipids like triglycerides, they would attract to each other because they don't want to be around the water, and so you'd end up with these huge globs of fat in the bloodstream. So these lipoproteins are basically going to create little spheres around a small amount of lipids in a way that is going to be palatable and okay to carry in a water-based bloodstream. because the phospholipids actually do like water a little bit, and the proteins do have an affinity for water, we don't have a worry about them globbing together. They'll disperse evenly throughout the water-based blood. Now, fatty acids, when they're just on their own, those are soluble in water. They are soluble in the blood, and so we don't need a special transport system for fatty acids when they're by themselves. So keep in mind, this is just talking about like when we have lipids in their entirety, like a triglyceride or a cholesterol, right? That is the entire molecule all together, and it's hydrophobic still. So we have to create an amphiphilic, right? A likes water kind of sort of vehicle, right? To make sure the lipids are contained. So we have a few different classes of these lipoproteins. We have the chylomicrons. This is just so that we can bring the lipids in through the small intestine. We have VLDLs, right? These are going to move triglycerides made from the liver to the fat cells. But then the ones that you probably have heard of are LDLs and HDLs. LDLs are low density lipoproteins. That's what LDL stands for. Low density lipoprotein. They are carrying cholesterol to deliver to the cells in the body. And when this number is too high, this is what you think of when you think of, oh, your bad cholesterol is high. Oh, my bad cholesterol is high. That's the LDLs being too high, because it's starting to deposit the cholesterol not just in the cells but also in the walls of your arteries, which can lead to blockages. HDLs, or high density lipoproteins, take the excessive cholesterol from cells and take it back to the liver to be removed. So your HDL is like your good cholesterol, because it's transporting cholesterol from the cells to the liver so that it can be taken out. So LDL is your bad cholesterol. We're taking cholesterol to your cells. It creates deposits. HDL, we're taking cholesterol from the cells to your liver to get rid of it. Of these ones, the ones that I'm pretty much guaranteed I'm going to ask you about are LDLs and HDLs, because that has to do with people's cholesterol levels. So how do we make lipids, right? When we have more energy available than we need, right, we don't need to make ATP, right? ATP is not as good at storing energy long term compared to things like carbs and lipids. We can start to make fats, right? We can start to make those lipids, namely triglycerides, because they're going to be good for a long-term storage. So lipogenesis is the process of taking that excessive nutrients, excessive energy, and forming lipids. Namely, again, we're creating triglycerides. So this is an anabolic process because we're taking small things and building up bigger. We're going to go through glycolysis, but then when we get to acetyl-CoA, instead of going into the Krebs cycle and everything, we're going to form fatty acids and glycerol, which creates fat. So really similar, right? We're just basically branching off from glycolysis. Rather than continue to go to the Krebs cycle and go to the ETC, we are going to kind of go off to the side, create glycerol and fatty acids to make lipids. That also means that we can break lipids down to enter into cellular respiration as well. Thinking back, we entered in, right, from glycolysis, we created fat. We could enter right back in. Notice those arrows go back and forth, right? Those arrows go back and forth. So we can use fat to break down into glycerol and fatty acids to enter in as acetyl-CoA and go right into the citric acid cycle. So this would be lipolysis, breaking down the lipids to access that chemical energy using lipase. So we can bring fatty acids into the bloodstream. Through this, we can use the glycerol in the liver, right, to make glucose. So there's a few things we can do, right? But basically what we're doing is we're breaking down the triglyceride, and at different points we're going to enter in to the cellular respiration process, just like we were able to go backwards. Now, beta oxidation, this follows lipolysis, so we've split the lipid apart, right? This is where we can take the fatty acids, right, have them go through beta oxidation, right, and then basically we can make our acetyl-CoA with this. So there's a lot on here. There's a lot on this slide right now. Don't worry about all the fine details, but the big thing you take away here, and we really see it if you look at kind of going through it, we start with our, with our fatty acids, and we're going to go down, and at the end of it, we get acetyl-CoA. So you don't need to remember all this crazy stuff, right? No way. But you should be able to tell me beta oxidation is what allows us to use fatty acids to create acetyl-CoA for the Krebs cycle. That's what I would expect here. Nothing more. Now, ketogenesis, we're creating ketones, ketone bodies like acetone. Right? These are water soluble. So acetone, hydroxybutyric acid, right? These are ketone bodies, right? These occur in the liver when lipolysis or lipolysis exceeds the use of the fatty acids. So we see this if someone is starving or if someone has diabetes, right? We'll see the uptick of ketone bodies, right? So we can use ketone bodies to make acetyl-CoA, so we can go into cellular respiration when we are without glucose. And when we have a lot of ketone bodies, this is what builds up and what we call ketosis. Now, this is also the basis of the keto diet, right? The keto diet wants to put you in ketosis. It wants this to happen so that you're utilizing fats instead of glucose, right? That's the whole basis of that diet. This is also the basis for someone who is diabetic to go into DKA, or diabetic ketoacidosis, where too many ketones are built up, and so the blood's actually becoming acidic, right? And that's dangerous, right? That's a medical emergency at that point. So for a diabetic, we don't necessarily want to be in that state. Now we can also use lipids to make glucose through gluconeogenesis, right? We already mentioned this process a few times, but this is where we are going to use things like fatty acids, use things like glycerol to make glucose that we can use later for glycolysis. Again, it's basically just the process backwards. Take the fatty acids, convert them to acetyl-CoA, and instead of going into the Krebs cycle, you're going to go backwards up through glycolysis. So you'll really notice, like, a lot of what we're talking about, again, you don't need to get in the nitty-gritty. I don't expect you to memorize, like, things like this, right? Like this picture here. What I want you to remember more than anything, is for you to understand the relationship, right, between the different processes, that we can go backwards and forwards within these chemical reactions depending on what's available and what we already have, right? What do we have? What do we need, right? Things like that. So that's really the biggest thing, is understanding the relationships between these different pathways, and that most of them can go in multiple directions.